Undercover CEO fired on his first day. What happens next? Shocks everyone. Before we get into this story, let us know in the comments, where are you watching from? And if you enjoy stories like these, make sure to subscribe, as we upload at the same time every day. You're fired! The words fell like a hammer on cold steel, resonating through the crowded warehouse corridor. A middle-aged man in a grey uniform had just dropped the bomb, but he had no clue who he was talking to or the devastation he'd just unleashed. 3 seconds earlier, that same man, Carter Briggs, was standing in front of a long table covered in mislabeled boxes, pointing fingers and barking orders at exhausted workers. Now, with those 2 syllables, he had severed the one lifeline that everyone else in the warehouse didn't even realize they had, and nobody else in the room had any clue that the man Carter had just fired was actually the new CEO, Jonathan Reed, working undercover on his very first shift. Up until that moment, Jonathan had been doing his best to keep his head down, to blend in, to see if the rumors he'd heard about toxic work conditions, shady payroll tricks, and fear-based leadership were true. Instead, he was face to face with a man who looked ready to tear someone apart simply because he enjoyed feeling powerful, and the tension was enough to make even the bravest souls hold their breath. Jonathan remembered the board meeting that led to this covert operation. He had listened to a series of claims that the logistics giant, Titan Corp, was rotting from within. He'd heard stories of managers verbally abusing their teams, of payroll being manipulated, of injured workers receiving no proper care. Yet every time he tried to get more answers, higher-ups swore everything was fine, just a few disgruntled employees. Something in his gut told him it ran deeper. So, after careful planning, he'd shaved his beard, cut his hair, and donned a set of plain work clothes. He wanted to see firsthand the reality of the company he'd inherited from his father. And if Carter's raw, "You're fired," was any indication, the rumors were more than true. He was no more than 3 hours into his first day on the ground floor, and he'd already been singled out for punishment. Before that moment, the initial hours in the warehouse had been eye-opening for Jonathan. The place looked worn down, chipped concrete floors, flickering fluorescent lights that buzzed incessantly, the air thick with the smell of cardboard and stale coffee. He'd spent the morning working side by side with Maria, a single mother of 2 who looked like she might faint from exhaustion. She guided him on how to properly scan and stack boxes, how to note certain codes, how to avoid the dreaded mislabel fiasco that would spark Carter's wrath. But even Maria, who seemed kind and helpful, had fear in her eyes. At first, Jonathan didn't push too hard. He was just there to gather intel. Then he noticed the subtle clues. A big, robust lock on the break room door that required a special passcode employees weren't allowed to have. People had to ask permission just to grab a moment's rest. A woman named Dana was reprimanded for taking a 5-minute breather because her blood sugar was low. Another worker, Marcus, nearly dropped a heavy box on his foot, and when he winced in pain, Carter grumbled something about weaklings not lasting here. Jonathan felt his blood pressure spike. The stories he'd heard were turning out to be true. The so-called petty tyrants in charge of the warehouse were much worse in person. 15 minutes before Carter's public explosion, Jonathan had made a small mistake on a packing slip. It was a tiny error, transposing 2 digits in an item code, and any conscientious supervisor would have just corrected him, or at worst told him politely to pay more attention. But not here, not with Carter. He stared at Jonathan with cold, narrowed eyes, scowled, and said, "You better watch your step, new guy. We don't tolerate stupidity." That was the first clear red flag. Jonathan felt his heartbeat quicken, not out of fear, but out of anger. He wanted to ask, "You think it's stupid for me to triple-check safety protocols so we don't get someone hurt?" But he held his tongue. The plan was to observe, not to blow his cover too soon. Instead, he gave a respectful nod and tried to move on. Then the second red flag came. Carter deliberately assigned him an impossible task, moving a stack of oversized boxes to a platform that was basically at chest height, alone and without any mechanical lift. Jonathan tried to manage, and Carter just watched from the shadows, waiting for the inevitable mistake. One box slipped, nearly knocked him to the ground, and Maria rushed in to help him. Carter yelled at her, "Who said you could leave your station? Don't coddle the incompetent. Let him fail if he can't do it." The rest of the crew kept their distance, eyes darting away. They'd seen this routine before. A new hire becomes Carter's target. Carter piles on the stress until the new employee either quits or breaks. Typically, nobody intervenes because they can't afford to get fired themselves. A job's a job in this economy, and Titan Corp was the only big employer in this region for miles around. But Jonathan wasn't just some new hire. He was the final word in the entire company. He watched Carter's smug face, thinking, if only you knew who you were talking to. Yet a part of him also felt a strange sense of fear. What if this was more than just one toxic manager? What if the entire system of Titan Corp's regional operations was governed by people like Carter? That fear made him want to keep his head down, to keep gathering evidence so that when he finally revealed himself, no one could dispute the changes he needed to make. So, he swallowed his pride and told Carter he'd do better next time. The manager just sneered and strutted away, as if daring Jonathan to make a single wrong move. But then came the tipping point. The day was nowhere near over, yet Jonathan's muscles were screaming from the manual labor. He decided to get a drink of water, just a quick sip, and he noticed Maria was being harassed by Carter near the staff lockers. The argument seemed heated. Carter was gesturing wildly. Maria was on the verge of tears, and at one point she tried to hand him a small piece of paper. Jonathan eased closer, straining to hear. "My daughter's sick," Maria murmured. "I was just asking if I could." "Switch shifts," Carter interrupted. "Don't you even think about playing the sympathy card. If I catch you sneaking out early, you'll be gone. I don't care if you've got a dying dog or a dying grandma. You show up, you do your job, or you leave." Maria's eyes brimmed with tears. Jonathan's fists clenched involuntarily. Another piece of the puzzle slid into place. This wasn't just about inflated egos. It was a culture of fear, one that took advantage of employees who had no alternative, one that might be tied to something bigger, like forcing workers to work overtime without pay or scaring them into compliance. Right then, Jonathan decided. Enough was enough. He stepped forward and gently said, "Actually, I can cover some of Maria's duties if that helps." It was a small suggestion, the kind of thing an ordinary coworker might do. Carter's face turned red. "Who the hell do you think you are?" he snapped. "You've been here 5 minutes and you're already playing hero. Let me make one thing clear. You are replaceable." Jonathan didn't back down. "I'm just offering to help." That's when Carter lost it. Maybe it was something about Jonathan's calm demeanor or the fact that the entire staff was watching, or maybe it was the threat of losing control in front of subordinates. Carter bellowed, "You think I need your suggestions? This is my warehouse. I run the show here. So here's my suggestion, new guy. Get out. You're fired." The words echoed, and for a moment the entire place went silent, save for the distant hum of machinery. That's the moment where Jonathan realized the theatrics had gone too far. This was an outright abuse of power. He locked eyes with Carter, feeling a surge of adrenaline. He could have ended the game right there, revealed his identity, and put Carter in his place. But then he saw Maria's eyes, wide with terror. If he spoke up now, Carter might retaliate against her or others, labeling them as troublemakers. Jonathan decided he had to find another way, a way that would ensure Carter and anyone else involved in these abuses would never set foot in Titan Corp again. Jonathan swallowed hard, feigning defeat. He hung his head, mumbled, "Fine," and started to walk out, his cover intact. He could feel Carter's smug grin burning into his back, and the hush of the onlookers. He didn't look back. No one dared to speak. As he left the warehouse, hearts pounded and pulses raced, but no one dared to challenge Carter directly. Jonathan's mind, however, was already formulating the next step. When Jonathan reached the parking lot, he let out a long breath, scanning the dull grey sky and the rows of identical trucks. He realized he needed evidence, concrete proof that Carter was not just a single rotten apple, but that there might be an entire network of poor managers who thrived under an environment that prized intimidation over real leadership. He'd known walking in that Titan Corp's culture might need an overhaul. This was the confirmation, but also the big question. Was it Carter alone, or was this a company-wide infection? And more importantly, would Jonathan be able to fix it without risking the livelihoods of the innocent employees who had no choice but to endure? With that heaviness on his shoulders, Jonathan got into his car and reached for his phone, prepared to set the next stage of his plan in motion. The phone call he made was to an old college friend, an investigative journalist named Chloe Stevens. Years ago, they'd promised to help each other if either of them ever stumbled onto a big story that needed unveiling. Jonathan thought if there was anyone who'd protect the whistleblowers in this mess, it would be Chloe. She answered on the second ring, and after a tense greeting, Jonathan spilled everything that had happened that day. "This isn't just about me being fired," he explained. "This is about hundreds of workers under this manager who are likely dealing with wage theft, emotional abuse, maybe even unsafe conditions, and it's happening under the radar of the general public." Chloe listened carefully, asked him to gather whatever documentation he could, and promised to get her news outlet interested in the scandal. They arranged to meet later that evening at a diner where Jonathan would hand over any evidence he could gather: time cards, pay stubs, recorded testimonies, whatever would help Chloe blow this wide open. Jonathan ended the call, adrenaline pumping, and realized the gravity of what he was about to do: blow the whistle on his own company. He knew it was risky. The board might see him as reckless, investors could panic, and stock prices could fall. But if Titan Corp was truly rotting at the core, then it was his responsibility to be the cure, no matter the cost. There was a part of him that was deeply embarrassed too. He was the CEO, and he couldn't even make it one day in his own warehouse without being fired. Yet, in that humiliating moment, he also discovered the rotten nerve that needed to be exposed. With his plan taking shape, he headed back to his downtown apartment to regroup and outline the next steps. He had to do more than rely on a journalist. He needed real proof, and that proof would come from the people Carter had victimized. But how would he get them to speak up without fear of retaliation? He fired off a text to Maria, hoping she'd trust him enough to at least meet outside of work. He'd memorized her number from the sign-up sheet that morning. "Hey, it's Jonathan, the guy who got fired today. I want to help. Can we talk?" The message felt awkward, but this was his best shot. A few minutes passed with no reply. He paced around his living room, the minimal furniture echoing the tension he felt. Finally, his phone buzzed. It was Maria. "I'm scared to talk, but I can't keep doing this. Tomorrow, 6 p.m., at the coffee shop, near the highway." Jonathan exhaled, relief flooding through him. One by one, he'd gather statements from people. Then, with Chloe's help, they'd build a fortress of evidence that no denial from Carter or his cohorts could topple. The plan would be to present the findings publicly in the most dramatic way possible, maybe even on live TV if the story drew enough interest. That would not only bring Carter to justice, but force Titan Corp's board to confront the truth. Jonathan knew he might face blowback, but he didn't care. His father had built Titan Corp from the ground up with the belief that treating employees well was the cornerstone of success. Jonathan couldn't let that legacy become a sham. The next day dawned with a sense of anticipation. Jonathan spent the morning combing through Titan Corp's internal documents that he could access remotely. He found emails from HR representatives mentioning unusually high turnover in certain warehouses, particularly Carter's. He stumbled upon complaints that had been silently closed or marked resolved without any detail. The more he dug, the clearer it became that Carter had been getting away with this for far too long. As the hours crawled by, Jonathan made more calls, trying to find former employees who might speak freely. Most were hesitant. Carter's intimidation lingered even after they left, but a few had stories that matched exactly what Jonathan witnessed: withheld overtime pay, threats of firing for minor infractions, humiliating outbursts. They even mentioned injuries that had gone unreported. It was a powder keg, and once the story went public, it would detonate. By the time 6 p.m. rolled around, Jonathan was seated at a small table in a dimly lit coffee shop off the highway. It was mostly truckers and a few travelers passing through. Maria walked in, eyes darting nervously. She looked thinner than she did just a day ago, stress etched into every line on her face. She slid into the booth across from Jonathan and gripped the coffee mug the waitress placed in front of her. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Maria whispered, "Are you some kind of journalist or something?" Jonathan considered his answer carefully. "Not exactly," he said. "I'm actually the CEO of Titan Corp, but I was working undercover to see what was really happening on the ground. I know that sounds crazy, but it's the truth." Maria's eyes went wide. She nearly dropped her mug. "You're... what?" she stammered, her voice a blend of disbelief and pent-up hope. Jonathan nodded. I'm sorry I couldn't say anything sooner. If Carter knew who I was, I'd never have seen the real conditions. But now, I've got enough proof to take action. I just need your help, and the help of others who have been mistreated, so we can end this abuse once and for all. Maria's face was a storm of emotions. Fear, hope, relief, and worry flickered across it in turns. She told him, in a trembling voice, about how Carter had made her stay late without extra pay, how he'd threatened to dock her hours if she didn't come in on weekends, how every time she tried to ask for a slight schedule change so she could pick up her kids, he'd scoff and say, "Not my problem." She talked about the times she'd seen Carter intimidate new hires, just to show everyone who was boss, how he seemed to take a twisted pleasure in firing them publicly. Tears welled up in her eyes as she described how she wanted to quit many times, but she couldn't risk going without a paycheck, and nowhere else was hiring. Jonathan listened carefully, furious that this had been happening under his watch. He gently placed his hand over hers. "I promise you," he said, voice low and firm, "this ends now." Maria agreed to share her story on record, but she needed guarantees. Jonathan explained that he had an investigative journalist ready to report it. Maria worried about Carter's retaliation, but Jonathan assured her that by the time this story broke, Carter would be powerless. He wanted to do more than just fire the man. He wanted to make a statement that Titan Corp stood for something better. Maria left the coffee shop that evening with a mix of anxiety and determination, while Jonathan felt a renewed sense of purpose. He wasn't just there to save his company's reputation. He was there to protect people like Maria from men like Carter. The next step came faster than Jonathan expected. News of Jonathan's abrupt firing circulated within the warehouse. Rumors flared. Some said he had been incompetent, others that Carter was making an example out of him. A day later, Jonathan returned to the warehouse, not as an undercover employee, but as a silent observer. He parked down the street and stood by the loading dock, watching. Employees on break saw him, but pretended not to notice, except for one or two who gave him subtle nods. Word was spreading that maybe he was more than just a random newbie. Carter, of course, was inside, barking orders like usual. Jonathan could hear the man's voice echo, even from outside. He wanted nothing more than to stride in there and demand Carter's resignation on the spot, but the timing wasn't right. He needed the corporate board to see the evidence. He needed the media to be poised to cover it, and that meant playing a careful game. When Jonathan slipped away, he wasn't empty-handed. He had hours of security footage from the hidden cameras he'd quietly installed. He had audio recordings from employees who were finally brave enough to speak up, protected by anonymity. He had screenshots of electronic time logs that showed questionable payroll deductions. It was a mountain of evidence. The plan was to release it all to Chloe, who would break the story. Then, within hours, Jonathan would call an emergency meeting with the board. They'd confront Carter, strip him of his position, and show the world that Titan Corp does not tolerate such cruelty. Jonathan would make a public statement. It was risky. Publicly admitting your own company failed so spectacularly could tank its reputation. But Jonathan believed that doing the right thing, no matter how painful, would ultimately rebuild trust in Titan Corp. He just had to make it happen fast, before Carter, or any of his possible allies, tried to bury the evidence. That night, Chloe arranged to meet Jonathan at her TV station's studio. She reviewed the footage, her face hardening with every new clip. "This is worse than I expected," she murmured. "We'll run it. Prime time. And once it's out there, Carter won't be able to hide." Jonathan nodded. "I'll be at Titan Corp's headquarters first thing tomorrow," he said. "The board is meeting at noon for a financial briefing. What they don't know is that I've added an extra agenda item, management accountability." Chloe gave him a half smile. "Just be prepared for blowback." Jonathan's jaw tightened. "I'm ready." Morning dawned bright, but carried a sense of impending doom for those who had something to hide. Jonathan arrived at Titan Corp's headquarters wearing his usual tailored suit, a stark contrast to the plain warehouse uniform that hung in his closet at home. He breezed through the executive floor, where employees greeted him politely, none the wiser about the storm that was about to break. At precisely noon, Jonathan walked into the boardroom. The long table was occupied by the company's top brass, men and women who'd known Jonathan's father, who'd seen Titan Corp go from a small operation to a global powerhouse. They rose and smiled, expecting the usual pleasantries. Jonathan's face was grim. "I'm moving our financial briefing to the end of the meeting," he announced without preamble, taking his seat at the head of the table. Some board members glanced around, concerned. "Is there a problem, Jonathan?" asked one of the older members, Mr. Fletcher. Jonathan clasped his hands, looked every person in the eye, and said, "Yes, a serious one." He proceeded to lay out everything he'd discovered, pulling no punches. He showed clips of Carter yelling at employees, ignoring safety hazards, and making humiliating remarks. He read testimonies from workers about wage theft and intimidation. By the end, the room was deathly silent. How did this happen?" one board member stammered. Another demanded to know how Jonathan got the footage. Jonathan explained his undercover operation. There were gasps, and a few looked at him in shock, but no one dared to interrupt. "I was fired on my first day," Jonathan said quietly. "Fired. By a manager who had no idea he was talking to the CEO. This is what Titan Corp has become under our watch. This is unacceptable." The board members wore expressions of disbelief and shame. Jonathan pressed on. "Carter has a meeting scheduled here in 30 minutes to discuss warehouse productivity." He used air quotes, scowling. "When he arrives, he's going to face the consequences of his actions. And I don't want just a private dismissal. I want a public acknowledgement that we will not tolerate this behavior at any level." Some board members squirmed, obviously worried about the public fallout, but Jonathan was resolute. "I'm prepared to accept the consequences. The media already has the story. It will run. Our choice is whether we stand on the right side of this or appear complicit in his abuse." They agreed, some reluctantly. While a few wanted to handle it quietly, Jonathan put his foot down. "I'm not hush-hushing this," he said firmly. "If we do that, we might as well sign an open invitation for more predators like Carter to flourish." And that was the end of that. So the trap was set. Carter would arrive expecting praise, or perhaps to request a bigger budget. Instead, he'd meet the full wrath of a CEO who had seen enough. 29 minutes later, the boardroom door swung. Open and in walked Carter, chin high, a self-satisfied smirk on his face. "Hello, everyone," he drawled, ignoring Jonathan at first. "I've got the productivity reports here." He froze when he realized every eye in the room was drilling holes into his skull. Jonathan stood. Silence pulsed like a living thing. Carter blinked. Is something wrong?" he asked. Jonathan exhaled slowly, then said, "You said you're fired to me yesterday, Carter. Ring a bell?" Carter's eyes widened, confusion morphing into shock. He stared at Jonathan, scanning the suit, the authority in his posture, and then a flicker of realization dawned. "Wait, you—" He stepped back, as if looking for an exit, but the board members blocked his path. "I'm Jonathan Reed," the CEO said, his voice calm but cold. "And you're the manager who's been running Titan Corp's biggest warehouse like a personal dictatorship." Carter began to stammer. "Sir, I had no idea. I thought, this is a misunderstanding." Jonathan raised a hand to silence. "Him. You publicly fired me on my first day. You humiliated your workers. You stole wages. And we have the records to prove it. You bullied people with obligations. Single parents, new hires, anyone you thought you could push around." Carter's face was beet red. He tried to sputter excuses. "I was just enforcing the rules. Sometimes you have to be tough to get results." Jonathan shook his head. "No, Carter. There's tough, and then there's cruel. And you crossed that line, repeatedly. I'm not here to debate. I'm here to inform you that as of this moment, you're done at Titan Corp. Pack up your office. You have 10 minutes. The confrontation that followed was anything but quiet. Carter, in a desperate bid to save himself, shouted, "You can't do this to me! I've brought record profits to that warehouse. I've sacrificed my time, my health." He was practically foaming at the mouth, his voice breaking. Jonathan's expression never wavered. "I can and I have," he said evenly. "Your methods are an abomination, and Titan Corp will do right by its employees from now on." Carter lunged forward, slamming his fist on the table, shouting curses. Security was called. 2 burly guards marched in, but Carter wouldn't stop. "You'll all regret this," he howled, pointing at Jonathan. "You're humiliating me for no reason. Those employees are lazy, incompetent." He was cut off by one of the guards grabbing his arm. Jonathan remained stoic. "Let me make this clear," he said in a loud, steady tone. "You caused your own humiliation. Now please leave." With Carter forcibly led out, the boardroom was eerily quiet. A few members seemed shaken. Jonathan turned to them and sighed, running a hand through his hair. "We have to change," he said, voice heavy with emotion. "This can't just be about Carter. We need to investigate every warehouse, every department, and make sure this culture is eradicated." Most nodded. There was a collective sense of relief that the monster was gone, but also a looming realization that there might be more. For now, though, the first major step had been taken. Word spread through Titan Corp like wildfire. Employees in Carter's warehouse heard the news within an hour, and the immediate aftermath was almost surreal. Some who had cowered under Carter's reign of terror actually wept with relief. Others were so shocked that they didn't believe it at first. But when the official memo circulated, signed by Jonathan Reed himself, stating that Carter Briggs was terminated for violations of company policy and employee abuse, a wave of cautious optimism rippled through the workforce. Maria was among those who got the news while in the break room. She read it twice, tears welling up. It was an acknowledgement that her suffering had been seen, that justice was possible. Others started whispering about what might happen next. Would the new CEO come and fix the broken systems? Would there be restitution for unpaid wages? Everything was in flux, but at least the villain was gone. Meanwhile, Jonathan was busy behind the scenes. He contacted Chloe, letting her know the confrontation had taken place. She smiled through the phone. "This is going to be one hell of a story," she said. And indeed, by the evening news, Titan Corp was making headlines. The piece aired footage of Carter's abusive tirades. Employees had their voices disguised, but they spoke of the fear they felt daily. And at the end of the segment, Chloe cut to a short clip of Jonathan's statement. "We will not tolerate abuse of any kind at Titan Corp. We value our employees, and we will hold any manager or executive accountable if they violate that trust." It was a bold move. Some executives might have tried to minimize the scandal, but Jonathan wanted the world to see the company owning its mistake. He hoped transparency would plant a seed of trust. Over the next few weeks, a tidal wave of changes rolled through Titan Corp. Jonathan personally visited the warehouse where he'd been fired, this time in full CEO regalia. The same employees, who'd witnessed his humiliation, now watched him walk down the aisles, greeting them with genuine warmth. He asked them about their concerns. He listened to them describe the broken equipment, the lack of proper rest breaks, the short pay. He promised immediate action. And for the first time in a long time, people felt like someone in charge actually cared. "I can't fix everything overnight," he admitted openly, "but I can promise you that I'm going to do everything in my power to make this a better place to work." Maria, who had been so scared to even talk to him, approached him timidly. "Thank you," she whispered. "I know it might sound small, but I'll never forget that you actually listened." Jonathan smiled. "I meant what I said. I'm here to help." A wave of genuine gratitude washed over the employees. It was almost as if they were rediscovering hope. Still, not everyone was on board. Certain middle managers who had thrived under Carter's oppressive style worried they'd be next on the chopping block. They grumbled that Jonathan was too soft, that the company would suffer if they weren't allowed to. Demand results from workers. One or two threatened to quit. Jonathan let them. He didn't need that poison in his ranks. Meanwhile, morale among frontline employees soared. Productivity actually went up as people realized they didn't have to live in fear of being fired. For trivial mistakes, they could speak up about broken machinery without worrying about retaliation. Some of the best ideas for process improvement started flowing from employees who, until now, had been too scared to talk. From the outside, media outlets kept the story alive. Carter himself tried to give a counter-interview, claiming he was the victim of corporate politics and employee laziness, but it didn't gain traction. The evidence against him was overwhelming, and people had already seen the footage of his rants. Titan Corp's stock dipped initially when the scandal broke, but then it stabilized as investors realized Jonathan was handling the crisis decisively. In fact, many praised his transparent leadership style. Employees started calling him the boss who got fired, a nickname he found oddly endearing. Throughout it all, Jonathan felt the emotional highs and lows. The guilt of letting something like this happen in his own company weighed on him, but the triumph of seeing abusive leadership topple and replaced with compassion motivated him. He'd learned that real leadership wasn't about lording power over others or burying problems. It was about facing them head-on, even when it was painful. As the weeks turned into a month, the dust began to settle, and Titan Corp began a new chapter. People seemed happier, working conditions improved, and while Jonathan knew there was still a long way to go, the darkest day, the day he got fired in that grim warehouse, had become the catalyst for real change. One afternoon, Jonathan was making the rounds again, checking on the progress at the warehouse. He found Maria in a corner office, a makeshift manager's office that Carter used to occupy. She'd been promoted to a supervisory role, tasked with ensuring schedules were fair and that no one was overworked or underpaid. She looked up, startled. "Mr. Reed," she exclaimed, setting aside a stack of time cards. I didn't expect you today." He gave her a reassuring grin. "Just passing by to see how you're settling in." Maria blushed, admitting it was challenging to balance the new responsibilities with her family life, but she felt grateful and determined to do well. "I never thought I'd see the day someone like me could get a promotion here," she said, softly. Jonathan nodded, his heart warm. "You earned it," he replied. "And I believe you'll treat the workers better than anyone else. You know what it's like to be in their shoes." She smiled, tears of gratitude brimming. This wasn't just about punishing Carter. It was about elevating those who truly cared. As Jonathan wrapped up his visit, he stepped outside into the late afternoon sun. He paused for a moment, reflecting on the journey. In a matter of weeks, he'd gone from being fired in a humiliating spectacle to publicly firing the man who tried to ruin him. He'd exposed cruelty, faced down corporate inertia, and was now in the midst of transforming a toxic environment into one where people could actually thrive. It wasn't a perfectly tied-up ending. There were still audits to run, more investigations needed, and other warehouses to check. But for the workers who lived under Carter's reign, it was a tectonic shift towards something better. As he made his way to the parking lot, a small group of employees gathered near the entrance. One of them, a tall man named Marcus, stepped forward and offered his hand. Jonathan shook it, noticing the genuine gratitude in Marcus's eyes. "I just wanted to say thank you," Marcus said, voice tinged with emotion. "It's been a long time since I felt safe at work, but seeing Carter walk out of here in cuffs, man, that was something. It gave us all hope." Jonathan managed a modest smile. "I'm just doing what I should have done a while ago," he said. Marcus nodded. "Well, from all of us, thank you. We appreciate it." Jonathan gave a small wave, then headed to his car. He might be the CEO, but at that moment, he felt like something more important, a fellow human being, standing up for what was right. He drove off, thinking about the stories he'd heard. Dana, who needed breaks because of her medical condition, now had them without question. Workers now got paid for every minute they were on the clock. No more suspicious payroll deductions. Overtime was properly compensated. Safety training was enforced. HR was being revamped with a hotline for anonymous complaints. Little by little, the changes were taking hold, and Jonathan decided he'd keep showing up, unannounced, to C4 himself. He didn't want the new culture to be a passing trend. He wanted it ingrained in Titan Corp's DNA. The company needed more than just a statement or a policy. They needed leaders at every level who cared. Weeks later, the final scene played out in a quiet but significant moment. Titan Corp had organized a small gathering at the main headquarters, a modest celebration to acknowledge the improvements that had been made. Employees from different warehouses came together to share their experiences. Jonathan arrived, uncertain if people wanted to see him as a hero or if they still had doubts. To his surprise, a spontaneous round of applause rippled through the room when he stepped in. It wasn't the thunderous, staged applause of a corporate event, but the heartfelt gratitude of workers who had been rescued from a nightmare. He felt a lump in his throat. He made a short speech, no corporate jargon, no lengthy PowerPoint. He just said, "Thank you. Thank you for sticking with Titan Corp, for believing we could be better, for being patient as we make changes. I'm sorry for what you went through, and I promise we will keep listening and keep improving. You matter to this company. You matter to me." After the applause faded, an employee approached him with a small bouquet of flowers, a symbol of gratitude from the warehouse staff. Jonathan was touched. He realized that the real measure of success wasn't how many billions a company made, but whether the people who worked there felt safe, respected, and able to live their lives with dignity. Looking around, he recognized several faces from Carter's warehouse, people who once trembled in fear. Now they stood tall, laughing and chatting with colleagues from other facilities. A new sense of unity pulsed in the air. The day ended not with a roaring party, but with a collective sense of relief and the promise of a brighter future. Driving home that night, Jonathan couldn't help but think back to the very beginning. The moment Carter had bellowed, "You're fired," in front of everyone. It felt like ages ago, but in truth, it had only been a short while. That public humiliation might have been the best thing that ever happened to Titan Corp, because it unmasked the rot and forced Jonathan to confront it head-on. While losing face in front of everyone was painful, it also was the catalyst for a complete overhaul of the company's culture. Sometimes the worst moments lead to the most important transformations. He pulled into his driveway, the engine ticking as it cooled. He sat there, the soft glow of the porch light beckoning him inside. The crisis was over, but the real work, building a lasting culture of respect, was ongoing, and Jonathan was ready for it. He stepped out of the car, closed the door gently, and headed inside, a faint smile lingering on his lips. There was no grand fanfare, no more cameras documenting the aftermath. But in his heart, he knew that what they had achieved, what those brave employees had achieved by speaking out, was more valuable than any fleeting headline. People once silenced by fear now had a voice. A manager who wielded power like a weapon was out, and a new era had begun. As he locked up for the night, Jonathan realized that what started as an undercover mission to save the company from hidden corruption had ended up saving countless livelihoods, and maybe even saving Jonathan from the complacency that comes with privilege. He closed his eyes, breathed in deeply, and exhaled with relief. Tomorrow was a new day for Titan Corp, and for everyone who walked through its doors.